Welcome to the Bitcoin Bottom Line. I'm your host, Steven McClurg, and my co-host, C.J. Wilson. We're here with you with Matthew Pines. Welcome, Matthew.
Thanks for having me.
So Matthew, just jumping right into it, we met for the first time like in a shady coffee shop in DC. So now we're all like doing this like podcasting thing. One of the things that I've been really fascinated by as I've been like going to DC now and again, what's the general vibe and like how are people like yourself that have been in and around the machine? I would say, what's your discovery path for Bitcoin?
Certainly, and thanks for having me. I mean, there's a lot there, and obviously the past few months, there's been kind of more formal action. Obviously, I think manifested by the Lummis Gillibrand bill, which I think is getting traction. So from like a formal legislative perspective, that tends to anchor, policy discussion and focuses attention in terms of the media, in terms of conversation around actual pieces of legislation, as opposed to just being kind of a general topic. And so that I think has been the most sort of concrete recent evolution in the discussion of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency more generally, coming out of the issuance of the executive order a few months ago. And so that's kind of the narrow kind of DC vibe. Is now there's a piece of legislation, now there's tangible action taking place across the various departments and agencies in response to the executive order, a bunch of reports being written, and they'll be coming out over the course of the summer and into the fall. So that I think has changed the vibe in the sense this is a serious policy topic. This is now generating a lot of work on behalf of staffers and agency officials, and it's getting very serious and sort of concrete policy attention. And that's I think a welcome shift. I'd say the other kind of thing that's in the milieu is the sort of broader geopolitical tension. And while Bitcoin and crypto is not at the center of that story by any means, it does mean that the sense of priorities is shifted from where things were a few months ago. When there's a war on, when you're in the sort of potential great power competition, when the sort of dials on that end of the defense foreign policy spectrum get turned up, other things get turned down. And so, there's just not as much, I'd say, cognitive bandwidth to handle these sort of maybe peripheral issues, unless something comes to the fore. So, when you're in that environment, that tends to take a lot of the kind of national security focus. And since that's kind of my principal background is looking at Bitcoin, I sort of have spent the past 10 years supporting, various sort of national security related and homeland security related agencies, kind of doing like worst case scenario planning. Kind of came to Bitcoin more from like an independent kind of intellectual interest, and been sort of doing some more serious thinking and writing about the intersection between national security and Bitcoin. That is still, I'd say like emerging as a topic of serious analysis. And I think some of these executive order reports will start to draw some, more attention and sophisticated understanding on that topic to date. But yeah, I think the vibe is certainly different than it was a year ago. Now that there's more concrete policy action in place, but Russia war and rising geopolitical tensions tend to take senior leader attention.
Given the perspective of Bitcoin, which countries do you really see as a potential threat to Bitcoin being a global digital currency? Which nations are really embracing it more outside the obvious ones? And what's happening in the U.S.? Where does U.S. fall on the spectrum of support of Bitcoin as a currency?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I would say different time horizons, and I try to think in terms of scenarios and try to think of distribution of probabilities if we're trying to make predictions into the future. At the moment, the baseline case is United States, for all the maybe social media rhetoric, is a remarkably pro Bitcoin place. I mean, while the sort of policy actions and sort of social media hostility tends to get a lot of attention, if you just look on the facts of the ground, like thriving Bitcoin mining industry across the country, a lot of like dramatic positive trends in terms of politicians coming out with sort of favorable things to say about Bitcoin. If you look at sort of where that conversation was 2 or 3 years ago and compared to where it is today, sort of the trend has been uniformly positive. Doesn't mean that that's where it'll end up, or that things could happen along the way to sort of divert or derail that progress. But if I had to say, right now at the moment, the United States is one of the more, in terms of the like G7 countries, among the more pro Bitcoin countries in the world. I mean, Europe has a whole different matrix of constraints and motivation when it comes to digital currencies that make it a slightly more difficult environment for Bitcoin to prosper. Not to say that it will be extremely hostile, but I think it has a higher hill to climb in Europe. And obviously China banned it, kicked it out there, so it's not faring so well officially in China. And then yes, you look across the emerging market, developed countries, and there I think you have been more dramatic official progress. Obviously El Salvador being the marquee case, and whispers of movement in other Latin American countries and some countries in Africa, which are good signals of adoption. But when it comes to sort of the absolute magnitude of their relevance to the network on a global scale, those are interesting and positive steps, but are not game changers by any means. So that's like where things are today. When I step back and I think in terms of like the strategic situation and where Bitcoin could play a role, that's a much more complicated question. Because to a certain extent, you phrase the question in terms of Bitcoin as a global currency. It's not a global currency right now in the sense that people typically understand that term. It's a reserve asset that's used in certain local context as a medium of exchange, but its sort of dominant narrative is as a sort of reserve asset, kind of a synthetic commodity that's sort of undergoing volatile monetization as we speak. So it's got a long road to go before it would sort of be on par with, say, gold or U.S. Treasury market as a reserve asset security, to sort of underpin a monetary regime. And that's kind of where we're heading into some more like challenging period of history, where the next few years you're going to see increasing geopolitical tension as kind of this East versus West dynamic kind of increases in scope and scale, and hopefully we avoid all out war. But I bring that up in the sense that monetary regime, sort of the global dominant power, sets the monetary regime. And so what is the structure of the global economic and monetary system is sort of downstream of the prevailing geopolitical order, and that geopolitical order has been relatively stable in the context of U.S. hegemony after World War II, and that is what rising sort of revanchist states like Russia and China are trying to upset. They're trying to upset that geopolitical order, to carve out their own spheres of influence, and to sort of push back on the existing geopolitical system, and that includes the monetary system. And so to the extent Bitcoin is monetizing on its own kind of endogenous dynamic, it's going to bump up against that larger geopolitical great power competition. And there's a lot of ways that could unfold. But that's, I think, the story of where Bitcoin's going to head next this decade is how it starts to play a role in that larger dynamic.
We have a lot of people that are talking about Bitcoin countries, right? That are saying, oh, these countries that take advantage of the fact that they might have some extra fiat laying around or some extra assets, instead of buying some sort of, let's say, U.S. Treasury bills or something like that to sort of stabilize their reserves, they could buy Bitcoin. Do you see us getting to a point where we have a B7 as opposed to a G7 at some point, where people are taking the asymmetric risk because they know that due to the size of their economy or the size of their population, they can't ever scale to China. They can't ever scale to America from a consumer standpoint, GDP standpoint, but they could scale to a Switzerland, theoretically as a powerhouse financially or as an authority.
Yes, and it could happen. I won't say it won't happen. I'd say that there's going to be different types of countries that face different, again, kind of a structure of motivation and constraint, because ultimately that's how states have to make decisions. In countries, while there's a lot of countries, a lot of them don't have a lot of independent power. A lot of them are either saddled with huge amounts of debt, don't have independent kind of military capabilities. They're reliant a lot on goodwill of international institutions. They're riven by internal civil unrest or political dynamics that make it hard to create like a coherent national, like hard for them to stand on their own feet and sort of challenge an existing order, which is what you're at sort of what you'd be doing. The countries that I think would be in a better position to do that are going to be the countries that are going to want to kind of try to position themselves in a kind of a neo-non-aligned movement, right? If the world is going to go down this sort of bifurcating Cold War 2.0, kind of pick your side. Are you with the West, U.S. position, in which case, we call the tune, and the dollar is going to be imposed on you, even if it's not necessarily in your domestic economic interest, or go with the Chinese and see how well that fares for you. And a lot of countries, maybe that's not an ideal choice. And if there's a third kind of non-aligned version of kind of a monetary regime that they can sort of opt into in a way that doesn't get them on the bad side of either of those two kind of bifurcating forces, that could be an attractive option. And that would probably be mostly attractive to exporting nations, kind of middle income or exporting nations that have excess surpluses that they've typically recycled into Western asset markets. Like the Saudis, for example, or other members of OPEC, that they take those excess surpluses and they pile it into euros or into dollars, into US real estate, into our equity markets. And our capital account has been open to them for that very reason, right? We have to maintain an open capital account to have the dollar be the global reserve currency. That means all those exporting countries recycle their surpluses into our asset markets. Now, that deal works out really well as long as they're confident that that capital account will remain open to them under all political conditions and future political administrations. And I think, if you're a Saudi prince, if you're a leader in these, so there are other OPEC countries, maybe not the best human rights record, you may look at that and say, all right, well, what's the chance that capital account that's open to us now may get closed into the future? And your other options are China, and that's maybe attractive on the margin for certain things. And maybe there's certain deals you would make to sort of recycle surpluses into China, but that's not a really great option either. I mean, the Chinese capital account is not open really at all, and their assets aren't necessarily as attractive. So if you had an alternative neutral reserve asset that you could diversify some of your excess surpluses into in a way that didn't upset any of the sort of political kind of that sort of bifurcating geopolitical dynamic, that may be how Bitcoin at a nation state level becomes more attractive as a reserve asset. And then play that out like a few more steps, and that if that takes hold, it becomes that would be the sort of the ratchet monetization. It would increase its liquidity profile, make it more attractive to hold more assets into it, and then it becomes better option for other similar states, and then those similar states may eventually kind of form some sort of quasi union. Again, that's a few steps ahead, more speculative, but that would be the path I could see it playing out. Would be from those kind of exporting nations that are trying to diversify into some outside money. Gold would be their other option. That'd be like the old standby. But if you're still selling your products and you demand gold, that's a lot of physical gold settlement, and you're reliant on the security protections of the states that you're trying to diversify away from. So the U.S., Fifth Fleet is there essentially guarding those gold shipments, and so that in a sense is still a call as a constraint on them able to move too far away from the dollar reserve system. Ultimately, it's the security umbrella of the United States that underpins those geopolitical decisions, and so Bitcoin is maybe a step almost before that, right? It's like they can do it, and they don't have to essentially forfeit that security protection potentially.
Right. Yeah. About a year ago, Steven and I did a thing where we were talking about El Salvador is the first domino potentially of a wave of Latin American countries, because a lot of them have very similar dynamics, like you're saying, constraints, maybe controls, things like that. They might have a little bit more stability with a longer term president, or a more let's say one party system or something like that, so they can kind of green light something the way Bukele did and kind of ram it through quickly. It really makes a lot of sense if you have a bunch of those Central American countries kind of, like you're saying, unionizing and doing some sort of independent thing on their own, because they're all sort of in the same boat. If you have these massive, India, China, America, these huge, maybe too many people or something like that, it's just, there's too big of a thing. It's too glacial, right? It can't innovate because it's too much of an institution. It's too concrete. And I think that's where I see it, where you're going to have smaller countries that want to get together because they have incentives, in that regard, to not be small forever, right? And not get picked on by the big countries, but they're not big enough to like start a war with anybody. It's almost like the USSR breaks up and you have all these other sort of splinter factions that create their own geographic or ethnic regions or something like that, and they can kind of be their own sort of border against Russia in a way. But I do think that, like, you brought up something in the earlier thing, so I just want to talk about this really quick. Financial policy and national security, right? Bad financial policy is bad national security, right? You effectively are shooting yourself in the foot if you have bad financial policy, bad money, whatever. And that's really why the European region is like such an interesting case right now, because you have a couple people calling the shots with the ECB, IMF, whatever, and then they're really in certain ways blowing off Bitcoin, like you said, right? Does that create security issues for them at some point, individually as countries, to have Christine Lagarde basically dismissing Bitcoin and things like that? I mean, what's like, I guess because America's only one country in the world, right? But it has obviously a big stick. But to me, it seems like the European thing there's a lot more room to improve the Bitcoin policy there in that regard.
Yes, and so Europe is a whole nother topic, but I'd say in summary, one thing that makes it a little bit more unique is it's an economic union, but it's not a political union, and so they have sort of this inherent crutch that they have to kind of navigate, which is they don't have unified political consensus really as like a governing country. It's like a super federalized system where certain things are delegated to Brussels, but sovereignty is still a strong kind of force. But they have unified monetary organization, and so the euro is a new thing. It's like only been around for 30 years or so. And so if you think about it, it's like just not that much longer in the historical scheme of things that Bitcoin's been around. And so they have a lot of vested political interest in the success of the euro. And so they're much more acutely conscious of anything that could like threaten the euro as like a monetary unit that has like a political objective to try to unify a fractious, historically warring set of states. Whereas the United States, like the dollar, we've just gotten used to the fact that the dollar is a dollar. Like it's so strong, like no one really thinks that like, even if the dollar were to weaken, no one thinks that like the dollar would like lead to collapse of like the states, right? Whereas in Europe, it's like that's like a live issue. Like not too long ago, there was a franc, there was a German mark, and so they have a much more acute sense of like currency as a political unifying entity, and anything that could kind of come in and chip away at that is going to be inherently regarded suspiciously. And to your point about like, yes, like economic security is national security. I mean, that's like the precondition, because if you don't have economic security, if you don't have economic health, you can't afford national security. You can't afford the weapon systems. You can't afford the balance of trade that you would need to say not be running a terrible energy policy against your adversary, right? Or reliance on supply chains that come from your adversary, right? Like these things are main elements of national security. And the United States is belatedly, I think, waking up to that. I mean, other countries, I think, have a much more kind of coherent view of like competition as a sliding scale of war. And China has a doctrine whereby like great power competition vis-a-vis the West, the United States in particular, is seen across all dimensions, economic, political, digital information environment, including, hard military contest. And they see it as just like one seamless sort of domain of competition. And they're going to use all the levers they have to pull to try to, get an advantage. And the United States, like we sort of say similar things at a strategic level, but like operationally, we have very discrete departments of agencies that have a very narrow remit. And the Treasury Department has a working group with maybe some DoD and intelligence people on it. But oftentimes at a strategic level, that doesn't like cash itself out in terms of operational policy. In narrow domains like sanctions policies or embargoes or these sorts of things, when you're trying to hit Russia, yes, that's when like the whole interagency comes together and like brings economics and military and intelligence and has like a seamless integrated approach. But in practice, it's, we have much more of a laissez-faire style economy, right? Like China's a command style economy. They can just like instruct everyone to like execute the plan. Whereas the United States, we have to like cajole, we have to incentivize, have to convene roundtables with a bunch of CEOs, and they say, yeah, that sounds a good idea. And then ultimately, the shareholders have to get their cut. So we have a much more like complex system. We can't just like press a button and everyone is now like on the same page and like countering China. And And that's just inherently, it's a benefit of our system. There's no like top-down command and control, but it means that we're just gonna be slower. There's a lot, more moving parts and pieces, and potentially divergent interests that will say the right things, but maybe won't actually pull their weight. So yeah, I mean that's the constraint of the West. I think though, that's the competition you're seeing play out, right? State-led, autocratic, kind of command style systems trying to upset, the traditional democratic kind of capitalist order. I mean, that's kind of the quasi war that's going on right now.
It's almost like China is super centralized, and that creates its own set of vulnerabilities, right? It's weird. It's like,
yeah, I mean, she is a one-man show, and what he says goes, and it may not be the best idea, and I won't go off on a total China tangent, but there are rumblings beneath the surface of dissatisfaction in the elite party cadres, and the number 2 in China, Li Keqiang, just gave like a big speech to about 100,000 sort of party officials, and didn't come out and directly contradict Xi, but it harkens back to a similar period under Mao when the number 2 at the time, Li Shaoqi, had like a similar sort of mass cadre kind of instruction that kind of went against what Mao was saying, and Li Shaoqi ended up getting knocked off and house arrest and then died. So there's a sense of this political dynamic at the top of the CCP is quite tense as they go into the 20th Party Congress later this summer. And yeah, those authoritarian systems are not ideal information processing engines. And no one wants to say the wrong thing to the boss, and you go bye-bye.
Yeah, that's it's a different thing, but the way you're saying it in regards to how the West has more need to get people on the same page. It's kind of like the consensus model of Bitcoin nodes, right? You have like, we want to push an update or something like that. You have to get everybody to agree before it really gets like locked and loaded. And there's a vulnerability to that, which, like you said, is speed, right? If there is a vulnerable problem in Bitcoin's code, then that means that if you take too long to update it, someone can exploit it. In the same sense, a lot of political people now feel like there are operatives or agendas or whatever that are being pushed from specific, factions, organizations, whatever, that are trying to keep America, decentralized, spread out, not reaching a political consensus or a policy consensus or whatever. You work with the Bitcoin Policy Institute. What do you see as, maybe it's the same thing I see, that hopefully Bitcoin can bring more people together than it pulls apart. But I'll let you kind of freestyle on that a little bit.
Yes, I think Bitcoin Policy Institute is a new think tank that got put together to really put out more like rigorous, thoughtful, fact-based research analysis on like Bitcoin specific related policy issues to help inform the broader conversation, and also to provide resources to members of Congress, staffers, other folks in the administration. So there's like a resource, something authoritative that's well researched, that they can learn from, and that can inform their policy decisions. And so I wrote a long white paper on Bitcoin national security to try to with that objective in mind. Is there's a lot of maybe preconceptions, a lot of vague ideas that people have in their minds when they think of Bitcoin and national security. And I was like, all right, well, we need to have like a more serious, thoughtful, informed discussion about like, what do we mean by national security? What do we mean by the elements of our national power? And how does Bitcoin sort of support those in various respects? And so it kind of went through a number of areas where I think Bitcoin could help support U.S. national security in a way that's relatively straightforward, like not trying to stretch by any means. And I think you need something like that. You need that sort of conversation that's not like, like the typical social media battle, but like, hey, here's, where in government speak, right? Like, here's the language that you would understand. And that maybe you can then internalize, and in the bureaucracy, eventually it helps kind of inform that memo that may get written eventually, right? And that's sort of how policy works in our world, is memos and policy papers and decision briefs and, PowerPoint slides. And ultimately it's, what's in people's brains when they're writing those documents. And you got to give them some locus of facts and analysis. It's not just going to be like whatever they picked up from, Gizmodo or Digiconomist, right? So yeah, I think that's one of the objectives there. Is Bitcoin still new? And even folks like us who are really into it, there's a lot of stuff that's like hard to keep up with, right? And it's constantly changing. And you've got the whole crypto world, and that's like its own little beast. And I think it's just, it is, you can put yourself in the mind of a decision maker or policy maker and realize there's a lot of things that are happening, not just in Bitcoin, not just in crypto, but like all over the world, right? And it's like a big, messy, chaotic place. And, you're just going to default to like a simple heuristic. You're just going to default to like the simple narrative. And if that narrative is negative, that's just going to be locked in people's minds. It, maybe it gets wedged into sort of the partisan polarization, engine that runs DC. And that's how you can kind of get to a suboptimal, state, right? And so the objective is to sort of untangle that and then, reset with some basic facts and start the discussion without some of that, baggage. But yeah, I mean, that's the objective. We don't need to have like a national Bitcoin policy that's like rah pro Bitcoin. We're adopting it as a medium of exchange. Like, great. Like, but I'm a pragmatist, right? Like, start where we are and build progressively over time and get people to understand this isn't like a crazy thing. This isn't like some wild idea. This is like a serious policy discussion, and you should like treat it like you treat any other kind of complex topic to be assessed.
Well, speaking of political narratives that are out there and the U.S. energy policy, and can you share a little bit about how the narrative of Bitcoin consuming the amount of energy that it consumes, which, by the way, everything that we've seen is vastly overblown. How did that narrative get into political circles? Number one, and just as you described, it's a simple narrative. It's stuck, and now it's hard to get rid of it. And what are you guys doing to try to combat that narrative or bring the right information into place?
Yeah, I mean the historical kind of exegesis of that is hard to untangle. I mean, there's that like famous Mora et al. Paper, which Troy Cross has sort of unearthed like the secret story of basically it was like a grad student like threw it together, from like a workshop with class. It was like just like slapdash, and then two professors took it and submitted it as a comment to Nature, and it got published, and then everyone started citing it as if it was like this grand research, even though it was just like complete garbage science. And so like there's just unfortunate like episodes like that just happen to create like this like anchor of misinformation that everyone then kind of attaches other stuff to. I know some of my colleagues at BPI, Margot Pius and Troy Cross, are like, this is like their prime directive is to try to like hit this FUD head on. And Margot this summer and this year, I think, is doing like a deep dive like research, right? Because you can rebut it with arguments, but you ultimately need data. You need to like look at what's happening on the ground, like look at the mining industry in the United States, North America, around the world, and actually like investigate the claim empirically, right? These are not like theoretical claims. These are like, you can like look at the data. You can say, all right, where is the energy coming from? What is its effect on the grid? Is it having a net positive externality, net negative externality? Like that's an empirical question that can be answered, and you just got to answer it, right? And that takes some time and energy and effort and data and analysis and writing, and just that's in the process. And like the Mark Twain, right? Like you can just make up FUD, right? And like push stuff out there. It takes no effort. Coming up with facts and truth that's like anchored in real data and well sourced, that takes time and effort. And so there's going to be a lag. And I think, part of it's trying to get ahead of it with messaging and saying what we can say with the data we have. And that's, I think, some of the things we submitted in response to the government's RFI for the Office of Science and Technology Policy and EPA, which is going to be writing a report specifically on crypto and energy use. And so they put together a 10-page white paper that you can look at on our website to try to like, say what we can say from a kind of a fact-based perspective on Bitcoin energy. And, whether it will be successful or not, I think it's more a matter of, who's writing those reports and who's got their ear and where things lie. I think net though, facts on the ground are what tells the tale, right? Like campaigns on bus stops funded by, Ripple executives make a splash in the short term, but like Bitcoin mining companies investing hundreds of millions of dollars in operations in states around the country with job creation and tangible impacts to the grid, like that is a more enduring story that's, by definition, not refutable.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the understanding the source and the seed and the incentive for some of this FUD is the most direct way that Bitcoiners on Twitter have been, attacking this FUD for years, really, right? Because the Mora paper was from 2018 or something like that, I think. And immediately everyone's been tearing it apart. But now that, like you said, Troy pulled that story out, it's been really kind of hilarious because the guy himself is like, yeah, I mean, I was like in college just trying to throw this thing together, and now these people are citing it. And of course, like, you have Nick Carter and some of these other well-known FUD destroyers are just constantly pegging it, right? So, but I have to ask you personally, I've known you for a couple months now, I guess. Overall, I've been following you on Twitter for a while. I see that you're kind of increasing your shit posting quotient a little bit. Like, you're adding some of your, more personal thoughts and feelings and kind of memes and stuff like that into it. How do you weave because you're a young guy, right? I mean, you're not like some geriatric guy that was been working in DC for 60 years. How do you weave the sort of the hardcore Bitcoiner blood, and the sort of boiling blood of a Bitcoiner into the having to play nice in the think tank settings, in the government settings and stuff like that? Because it's got to be like has to be a side of it where you can't let it all out, right? You have to kind of filter it and think, is my job at risk if I just kind of unleash right now? Because everything gets posted online at some point, right? Or reposted.
I mean, again, all my views are my personal views, not my employer's views. So, but yeah, I mean, I think this is a serious policy debate, and, you need to inject humor and, liveliness into some of these things. And I'm just like intellectually obsessed with all things like macro, FinTwit, the monetary plumbing, geopolitics, and all that stuff, which is like we all have our day job, right? And our day job is usually not solving these grand questions of global strategy, right? You have like a near-term tactical client. I'm in the consulting space. There's a geopolitical and kind of cybersecurity core to what I do day to day, which allows me to think about these larger questions that are in the context. But like my day job is, somewhat orthogonal to those things. But yeah, I think, Bitcoin, it's weird. Like, it started as this fringe niche subculture. And it's just becoming something your grandfather can buy, right? So yeah, like, am I going to be like I'm a toxic Bitcoin maximalist, just with whatever that connotation has, I don't know. I don't know. It depends on what you mean by that term. But it's like I have a clear policy view. I think it's anchored in my assessment of the situation. I want to make sure that's represented accurately. And then it's Twitter, so you got to have fun with it.
So I as someone who's really pivoted from pro athlete talking about family and cars and macroeconomics into just mostly talking about Bitcoin on Twitter, I think eventually you'll just get there. You get to the point where it's like you can answer it with a Bitcoin filter. You know what I mean? You're going to answer it with the Bitcoin filter. But we're talking about just regulation in general, and I want to kind of get like a good scope on this. Right now, regulation comes from, let's say, legislative proposals, right? But then the enforcement actions are sort of driving policy right now because there hasn't been a comprehensive bill. Obviously, Lummis and Gillibrand have this thing that they've been packaging, sending it to other people, trying to get some sort of consensus behind the scenes. I got a chance to read it a couple months ago. I think it's really positive for Bitcoin. Maybe not so much for people that want to start algorithmic stable coins or things like that, But the filtration of information in the fintech world, let's say Wall Street or something like that, you have this sort of like these verticals of, let's say the SEC regulation, and then Wall Street, which is effectively private practice, right? And then you have these cabinet people that sort of get appointed, or these government people that sort of filter back in from the private practice. So there's like a churn there. I don't think we're really there yet to have, let's say, hardcore Bitcoin people working in the regime or working in the government or anything like that. You have people that are very outspoken, positive about Bitcoin, Warren Davidson, Cynthia Lummis. But how far away do you think we are to seeing a sort of parallel to Wall Street where you have that turnover where we get kind of vortex back in and you have Bitcoiners maybe being the first phone call through like what I do at the Bitcoin Today Coalition, what you do at Bitcoin Policy Institute, or just, someone wants to call Jack, right? Yeah. One of the Jacks. We need the Jacks. Get the Jacks in here, right? How far are from that? Is that even possible with what we have going on globally right now to have a consolidated filtration of information like that?
Yeah, I think there's two dynamics. One is just time. Bitcoin's so brand new, and even as a like politically relevant force, it's like brand new, like 2 years maybe max, which is like less than a single election cycle, right? So you think of it in terms of like political time, you think in terms of numbers of election cycles. How many times has there been a candidate asked about Bitcoin? Has staffers been tasked with writing position papers on Bitcoin? Like that has to happen enough times over enough election cycles to where they say, oh, I need to have a staffer that's like well-versed in Bitcoin. And that staffer is then, potentially orange pill. And then the way that staffers sort of move up is they move up in the ranks, either inside Congress or they get a job in the White House or a job in a department agency. And they bring that with them and they're in a policy position and they're carrying those attitudes. It's like, that's typically how like I see that happening. It just got to take time. And we're at the very beginning of that process, and probably a few like election cycles where this is like an increasingly pertinent and salient issue is going to take for that kind of, osmosis to take effect. And then from a regulatory perspective, I mean, yes, like that's more like the senior kind of like the swampiness, right? Like the nature of the revolving door is, regulators are usually coming from the industries they regulated, right?
Yeah.
There's sort of the legalized political corruption we have, and there's sort of the quasi pay to play, donate to political campaigns and you get a meeting, right? And you see that, right? Like you see SBF, mobilizing $1 billion next election cycle, and that's probably going to raise a lot of, eyebrows along in the political sphere. So yeah, I think it's happening now, but in terms of people and the gradual, just like millennials moving up the ranks, right? We're like, middle management, but in 5 years, 10 years, they're going to be senior executives. And, that's how that happens. It's sort of organic kind of Overton window shift. I think, yeah, I mean, my time horizon for Bitcoin just becoming, I don't know, I'm not going to put like a price on it, but like politically established in the country is the end of the decade. I think it's going to take at least one presidential cycle where it's relevant. We haven't had that yet. And if there's like a pro Bitcoin that gets elected president, that would like pull forward, right, that a lot. But then I think in the absence of some like disjunctive event like that, the sort of slow organic is going to take several election cycles. And in the Senate, which are 6-year terms, that's a much more slower churn. And in our system where you need like, super majorities to pass big legislation, I just think that's going to take a longer period of time. So, by the end of the decade, I think we will have gotten there. Could happen sooner, but that's kind of my mental framework. I think we're at the very beginning of that process.
Yeah. Well, I think we've all been trying to convince CJ to run for Congress, Senate, president. I would vote for President CJ all day long. And, and when I retire, I've always wanted to join a SEC enforcement. I would love to just bust ICO scams all day long. That would be a lot of fun. And from seeing things from the other side, I think I could do it fairly quickly. But
hey, Gary, give Gary a call. He'll hire you on the spot. Yeah,
exactly.
I think he's a closet Bitcoin maximalist.
I think he is too. I really do. I really do. But Matthew, look, we're over time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you. I've heard a lot about you. I've never met you as CJ had, but it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you a little bit. And I've heard a lot about you from so many common friends, particularly some of the policy groups that you work with. And so we really thank you for coming on the show. This is the Bitcoin Bottom Line signing off.
Thanks for having me.